Hey everybody, welcome to Renewal Lesson 3. That's right. That's French for the word three. And I'm a man of many talents, most of them hidden, if you will. Anyway, hey, welcome to this lesson. And I'm excited about this. We've been going through the Lord's Prayer. And this little portion of the prayer they're going to be talking about with this lesson is that right at the end of the prayer, where Jesus prays, Lord, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So we're going to get to that here in just a second. Yeah, I remember when I was young, a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to go out to his place out in the country. And while I was out there hanging out with him, he brought out this mini bike. And he's like, hey, you want to ride the mini bike? I'm like, I'm all about this. Of course, this isn't something I would have told my parents at the time because they did not like me riding those things. But I jumped on it, and I was just going as fast as I possibly can like through his yard and around the farm there and things. And the throttle got stuck on open, and so I'm like going as fast as I can on this bike, and it wouldn't let up no matter if I let off the throttle or not. It just kept going. And so I've never been really on one. I had no idea how to even control it. So I'm just like screaming and yelling, like, somebody help me, somebody help me. And so finally I decided I'm gonna have to ditch this thing. And I didn't know if I was gonna run to the side of the house, a barn, a cow, I didn't know. And so I just all of a sudden just kind of turned it real fast. I got into what I considered a soft place in the yard and kind of ditched it sideways and kind of got hurt and kind of had to confess at home what happened. Anyway, it was that one experience as a young kid kind of shaped me for the future. Like, I did not want to get on a motorcycle or a mini bike or anything, moped for a long time. Now later as I got older, I did ride and found out, hey, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. But it's amazing how one experience like that can change your whole future. Now, it's not only like that with bad experiences, it's also like that with good experiences. I remember having some family and friends who have forgiven me from things that I've done wrong, or maybe forgiven me even from financial debt. And I remember one particular time when family forgave me from a financial debt that I had that was pretty substantial. And I remember thinking at that moment, this has got to change my life. I can't do things the way I've always done them, and continually kind of asking or seemingly asking for favors and things from people that it's not their fault. They don't deserve it, but yet they were gracious enough to do that for me. So good experiences can also change your future. Now, we're going to talk about that in this text, because if you look at this text in this particular prayer, when Jesus is talking about forgiveness, right before he gets here into, Lord, deliver us from temptation, or lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, you're going to find out that he's talking about, when it comes to forgiveness, about our past sins. And now this prayer is leaning more towards the future. How does it affect our future sins? And we're going to be talking about that as we get now. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to pause the video right now. I want you to pause and just go through the first two questions of the discussion together, and then come back and we'll start up again. Oh, we're filming? Oh, okay. This last year, it's been an interesting year for me. I decided sometime last year, well, in 2018, the end of 2018 anyway, that I was going to try to lose some weight, which I've needed to for quite some time. And so I went on this diet and actually lost like 50 pounds. then kind of hit a wall. And it went up and down with me, gained some weight back, but, and it had a lot to do, it all has to do with the diet. And when you're on a diet, I mean like a strict one, the temptations are just amazing. Especially when you're used to just picking up and eating like a bag of cookies or chocolate cake. And when I see those kinds of things, and I want to eat it so bad, but I got to remind myself why I'm on the diet, for my health and trying to lose weight. And so when you think of the word temptation, in a way, that's the kind of context we find it in most time when we're thinking about it anyway. At least that's how I find it. When I think of the word temptation, I think almost like I'm on a diet, being tempted to do something I'm not supposed to do. We also look at it that way when it comes to sin. The Bible is very clear about how the devil tempts us into doing things that God doesn't want us to do, to be people He doesn't want us to be. And we can really get off track with our relationship with God by giving in to these temptations. And so when we think about it that way, it is a little interesting and maybe a little bit confusing when we read this prayer. When Jesus prays, Father, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. It almost sounds like, when you first listen to it, as if God is tempting us, that possibly He's the one that's tempting us. Now, we know that that's not true, because according to James chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, I believe, you'll find that out there where James says that God doesn't tempt anyone to do anything wrong. We tempt ourselves. We are led away by our own sinful desires and are tempted. So when we think of this word tempting, what does it mean then in the prayer if Jesus isn't referring to the fact that God is tempting? When He says, lead us not into temptation, what's He really saying? Now, it's interesting because this word originally has this connotation of not just temptation the way you and I think about it in that context, but meaning testing, of a testing period. God, when we're going through hard times, which we all are going to go through, every single one of us, God does not necessarily just let us escape from every hard time or trial in our life. Instead, He knows that as we go through them, what kind of person we'll become as we become stronger, hopefully, in our faith. Some of us, it chases us away from faith. Some of us makes us stronger in faith. But God says we're going to go through trials. So Jesus' prayer is, what He's saying is, you need to pray on a consistent basis that God will rescue you or lead your feet, don't lead your feet into a world of temptation that you can't overcome, but instead that He will rescue when you go through hard times and you are tempted, not necessarily by Him. So one way to say what this text is saying is what Jesus says we ought to be praying, is praying, God, please don't let me fail when I come up against temptation. Please do not let me succumb to the temptation or surrender to the temptation and fail, but instead help me become stronger in faith and avoid sin. Now, I think that one thing that might help us in clarifying a little bit what Jesus is meaning in this prayer, this particular part of the prayer, is to maybe hear it as the disciples possibly might have heard it. There's an old Jewish prayer that was pretty famous, I guess, back then. It's possible that the disciples understood or knew this prayer, and Jesus is kind of echoing some of the sentiments of it. I want to read it to you. It's an old Jewish prayer. It goes like this: lead my foot not into the power of sin, and bring me not into the power of iniquity, and not into the power of temptation, and lead me not into the power of anything shameful. I think that really captures what Jesus is saying here. He's praying, Lord God, don't let my foot enter into the power of anything sinful. Bring me not into the power of iniquity or temptation or anything shameful. The word power there is really interesting. God, do not let me fall under that power, but instead under your power. Now, Romans chapter 1 is an interesting text where Paul actually states that God, at some point, will give us over to our sin, is what he says. When some people just ignore him over and over and over and decide that the temptations are too great, or they just want to live for the temptations that they succumb to or surrender to, When we just want to live for the sin, eventually God just kind of like stops intervening at some point and just says, I'm going to give you over to it. That's what you want. That's what you love. Hey, you can have it. And that's kind of a scary thought if you think about it. And I really think what Jesus is saying with this prayer is to keep it in our minds. It's a model prayer for us to keep on our minds all the time and to be praying on a regular basis for the intervention of God, that He might intervene and not be quiet in our lives. I mean, His intervention is so vitally important to give us passion that we need in order to be rescued from the temptations that we face when we go through trials. So, God's point here, Jesus' point with this prayer, you think, is that we desperately need the Spirit of God in our lives. And we need to desperately ask, humbly acknowledging the fact that we are in spiritual warfare every day, that there's a battle going on for our soul, that the devil's after us, but the world is after us, but that God does, He told us, as Paul wrote elsewhere, that there's no temptation that is too great that we cannot overcome through the power of Christ. So pray asking for God to deliver you from evil. Let me ask you this. Is it a part of your prayer life? Is it something that you pray all the time? It needs to be like Jesus modeled. We need to be asking for God to put us into His hands and to keep us safe from the hands of the enemy.